Okay, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. Welcome to our roundtable to discuss customer discovery benchmarks. Jeremy, switch the slide, please. So here is today's agenda. Really appreciate you carving out the time for us. So hopefully we're going to spend about 60 minutes today discussing some pretty interesting topics. I'm going to do my best to make sure we stay on time, which is going to be a hard task because we've got quite a bit of content. The first part of the session is going to be me talking through the research and some of the themes that we picked up. And the second part, we've got a pretty fantastic panel with the three J's, totally accidental, but we've got John, Jordan, and Jay from a couple interesting companies that we're going to dive into some specific topics. This report is a sort of summary of a deeper dive based on the work that we've done to date, and that report will be available for download after the session. And then we're taking questions, so we're going to carve out about 10 minutes at the end. And so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And Jeremy, who's the MC and provided the great music for us today, he'll summarize them all for us and ask them at the very end of the session. Next slide. So in terms of introduction, my name is Grant Monroe. So I'll be hosting the first part and then moderating the panel. And I'm alongside Jeremy Vo, who's helping with the logistics and was a key part of the research. In terms of my background, I'm a comp sci graduate. I went to University of British Columbia up in Canada. I should mention we're based in Toronto. Worked as a software developer for a few years at Motorola and Nokia. Moved into product management, and then in 2014. Followed the entrepreneurial route and started a business. That business was called Flashstock. It's where I met Jeremy. That business was in the content marketing space. That business grew very quickly and actually sold it in 2017 to Shutterstock, the big stock photo provider, and then worked with Shutterstock for about two years and a bit, integrating the business and learning a ton. And so, as I mentioned, I met Jeremy in 2014. He was one of the first employees. He joined Flashstock basically just at the beginning. Since then, we've worked together just building product for the last little while. We both left Shutterstock at the same time and, passionate about product, and we're chatting about product, but more specifically, like all the mistakes that we made and all the things that we were learning. And so we both agreed that the product is going to be a big part of our future. And so we sort of looked around at the landscape and saw that there were some topics that just weren't being addressed. And so we kicked off some independent research for us, selfishly to learn, but also share some of that knowledge with the peer group. This is actually our third of these research projects. So we did one previously on just common challenges that a chief product officer faces. There was an interesting follow-up to that one around capacity planning, and then this is our third iteration, which is customer discovery benchmarks. Next slide. So why this report? So when I coming from a product background at Flashstock, I was never really comfortable with how we had set up product. The larger the organization got, the further I was as CEO from the customer. And, when we're at 150 people, I just didn't feel like I had enough knowledge of the market to really make roadmap decisions and distinctions. And that discipline wasn't instilled within our product group. At Shutterstock, it was similar, where because of their success, they didn't have a core understanding of their key customers, and when growth started to slow down at that company, it became a real challenge. And so when I sort of step back and look at the ecosystem out there, you can clearly see within the startup world, like everything now is being launched. There's a SaaS tool for everything. And so in the long run, how do you stay competitive when you've sort of constantly got these new entrants coming into the market? And it seems like you sort of constantly have to have a really good answer to the questions that I've listed above. Some of those questions are really easy, like what do our current customers want? But some of those questions are really hard, like where are our untapped customer segments and what do we need to get to them? All of this seems to be a derivative of that core competence of customer discovery, which seems to be much more critical in the future. And so, in talking to a few different companies, it became clear that they were doing it so much better than I ever did. And so that kicked off the research, is to basically pick some of the best companies in the world and try to get a sense of how they do it. So that's what we're doing. Next slide, Jeremy. So the research approach, we took a customer discovery research approach where our goal was to talk to 50 chief product officers. We ended up talking to 54 in total, and you can see all the logos on the right. It was a mix of companies across Europe and North America. 90% of it was B2B SaaS. Company size was about 51 to 500. We felt that that was a good segment just based on size of company. All of the interviews were qualitative, where we would ask sort of standard set of structured questions, and then we aggregated the results and looked for specific themes. And so, yeah, there's a detailed report that we'll send out afterwards. So what I'm going to do now is just sort of summarize some of the more interesting learnings from that report. Okay, so the first step was level setting on nomenclature. So one of the things that we realized very early on is everyone has a different name for it. And so depending on what company you're in, you probably call it differently and you probably do it a little different. Customer research and customer discovery is the catch-all, but the naming, again, is slightly different and the deliverables different depending on the organization. There's a pretty good anecdote here from one of the chief product officers pushing the team to do more discovery, moving from building the product in the right way, which is really much sort of the traditional product management operational skill set, to building the right product, which is much more of a creative skill set. And so generally that's the acknowledgement, but again, it's sliced and diced many different ways depending on the type of company that you're coming from. Next slide, please. So why do you do discovery? So this was one of the interesting questions that really exposed some of the nomenclature gaps that we discussed. So the reasons really did vary. And so I'd say the biggest chunk of research or discovery happened within the existing customer base or even extensions into the prospects, but very little into the other areas of competitors, market segmentation, where are untapped markets, what's the general sense of the market. And so what was interesting is, the nomenclature was kind of all over the map. And I think that's potentially quite a dangerous thing, that in an organization, if there's an assumption that your product group is talking to customers, and that's just a general catch-all bucket, then it really needs to be clear what specifically they're doing. And if there are gaps in terms of that research, they should be filled in other parts of the organization. Again, most of the organizations focused on their current install base. And so the way that the product managers talked to their customers was very simple. They would do sales ride-alongs, client success, account management ride-alongs. They'd use the commercial side of the business to identify customers to have one-on-ones. And then a few would set up more the longer-term strategy structures like a customer advisory board or a product council. So coming from the startup world, our view is very, very different because we don't have customers, and so we're always looking for new customers, and so it's a bit of a skill set. And so it was interesting to compare that world to the more established company where the focus was really on your install base and not so much on those other areas. Next slide. So everyone had this general appreciation of why they would do customer discovery. And it was, again, to figure out what to build as opposed to build something correctly. Time varied in terms of the commitment that the different product teams would do. The majority of companies spent 20% or less, so 2/3 spent about less than 20%. 70% indicated that they wanted to do more. And of course, it was always the balance between figuring out the product versus what you're actually paid for as a product manager, which is delivering something tangible. Good quote there. We do 4 to 6 meetings a week. We'd like to do more, but are bogged down on the current backlog. That was a pretty common theme where you've just got a ton of stuff that you have to deliver based on immediate priorities. How do you actually get out of it and actually look for a longer term thing? Some of the interesting comments in this area were around frequency and volume. And so a lot of the product leadership said, it's not so much the volume that you do, it's more about the regular cadence and frequency that you do it. And so if you're doing it at regular systematic intervals, the amount of insight you get from a smaller set of customer conversations is much higher because you can track changes in the market kind of in real time. Next slide. The importance of customer discovery. So across the board, companies see this as an extremely high value activity. So 70% of the companies we spoke to rated customer discovery 5 out of 5 at importance. So, a good quote, without customer discovery, product development is pure luck. And there is a general understanding, at least at the product level, that it's cheaper to do research versus building the wrong thing. This sentiment doesn't seem to be shared across all executive positions, especially for companies that are a little more mature and they do have a lot of pressure on that short-term roadmap. There doesn't seem to be the same appreciation of value, which is more of a change management challenge. But the general consensus is if you're running a product team, whether or not it's formal or informal, the more time your product managers speak to customers, the better their ability will be to pattern match, which is very much a creative a creative muscle, which is a derivative of just reps in front of customers to hear as many different things as possible, which is very different than taking orders, than saying like, hey, this customer asked me for this, I'm going to deliver this. Very, very different skill set. And having more time with customers helps you really refine that pattern matching. So the next question is, so now we kind of get a sense of why you're doing it and how you're doing it. It's how do you actually select the customers and who's doing the interviewing. And so for the most part, PMs are doing the actual interviews. So 70% of the orgs had PMs specifically do it, and the other 30% would use internal teams, so product marketing, UI, UX, design, if they sat outside of the product organization. Majority of PMs use the existing customers for who to talk to, and so they're looking at that install base and trying to determine who's best to select. Most of the time, they're using revenue as the key criteria for whom to talk to. Clear trade-offs here. If you're focusing on your revenue clients, obviously you're going to show them more love, which is good, but this might not actually be representative of a broader customer segment, and so you could be building the wrong product for that group, and so that's something that needs to be thoughtful. And a lot of as mentioned, a lot of the research discovery is not directed in the sense that it isn't hypothesis driven. It's more about exposure, learning the market so that they can start to identify patterns, as opposed to, I want to learn this piece of information, let's go out and actually learn it in a systematic way. Training is an interesting topic. So like generally within product management, I think training, there does seem to be a gap. It seems to be lacking in a number of areas, but in particular customer discovery. One of the things that stood out for me when I was running my company, we had a pretty large sales organization, was the investments we put in training salespeople to have particular types of conversation. That seems completely vacant in the product world. 50% of people we spoke to in the product group did no training at all as it relates to customer conversations or discovery. 34% coached. They're more junior PMs, but there was a general assumption that, medium to senior PMs have that skill, and if there are particular gaps, then they could be coached out of it. This is obviously challenging because product managers do have quite a varied background, and so there's a clear need to level set capabilities with some sort of benchmarking or training in this area. Interestingly enough, there's very little use of external training. So there was very little emphasis on bringing in third parties. And so the sort of 3 or 4 most frequently referenced were Pragmatic, Teresa Torres, and Mary Kagan. And then on the governance side, very little governance into the process. And so there was not much visibility into who's doing what. There was just this general assumption of people are going out and talking to customers and doing the appropriate diligence and attaching learnings to various tickets, but there wasn't necessarily a large amount of governance. There's an interesting quote here around Chief Product Officer knowing that PMs are asking leading questions and not asking the right ones. This is obviously very, very dangerous, and this is where the learning and development and governance will play a critical role. Next slide, also really interesting. So one of the questions we asked were, is there any budget? Are you using any tooling? Are you doing anything to help product managers do research more effectively? And so there was no real standout tool. There was a lot of piecemeal work. So a lot of the research type work where people were going in and doing general discovery, a lot of their learnings were captured in some of these unstructured tools, which makes totally intuitive sense. So your Google Doc and your PowerPoints were mostly referenced and sort of pumping learnings into Slack or Confluence. A lot of wiki type stuff. So you can see there's a sort of clear distinction between operational tools that are used, so everything on the right, versus more of the creative, like what is the actual problem stuff on the left, which is much more based on intuition and pattern matching. One of the interesting themes that has come out in the research was like, what is the actual traits of a good product manager? Is it a creative job or is it an operational job? And you can see if you're coming from a much more creative background, trying to retrofit everything into these structured operational tools might be challenging. But clearly there's a challenge to share learnings, collaborate, and with COVID, it's obviously going to get much harder because you're having fewer side chats beside someone's desk. Interesting quote. No tools right now, but we want to centralize things. Since COVID, we have started recording calls. That's a really strong theme, is then taking those recordings, extracting the relative insights, and then sharing that to make it much more digestible from the organization. So sort of sort of final lower level question before we get into some of the broader themes. What's the hardest part of discovery? So again, this is from the chief product officer's perspective. So the first hard thing was the most frequent hard thing was really about managing those unstructured learnings and unstructured conversations and sharing that knowledge across the organization. And so how do you take all that information, figure out what's most important, and communicate that and action the things that are most important? This is obviously the essence of creative work, where research leads to your aha moment, which again takes a very special skill. And so all product managers aren't created equal, so you may have gaps in your organization. The second challenge relates to how to actually run effective discovery so that you're not biasing the answers. And again, this is more training, this is more cultural, this is sort of startup world 101, mom test type things, where you actually know that you're more of a fact-finding mission as opposed to validating your own hypothesis or your own features. And then the third is, of course, a traditional challenge of how do you balance the longer-term open-ended discovery stuff with the short-term. And so there's a good quote there to support that from the chief product officer: balance of too much and too little customer discovery, agreeing on questions, and doing it regularly. So one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this research was to come out of the end with a sense of like what good looks like. And so we did this exercise where we mapped out all the companies that we spoke to, so 54 companies, and sort of tried to list out some of the high-level capabilities that they were implementing within their organization as it relates to customer discovery. And so we broke them into 3 steps, and so I'll quickly talk through each one. The percentage is above. That's the percentage of companies that we felt, it's totally subjective, but we felt fit into that bucket. So level 1, we've dubbed it deliver. So there's really no formal discovery structure. The focus is on delivering what's in the backlog. There's emphasis on triaging customer requests either through the sales team or the account team. And in some cases, they may outsource the actual discovery or triaging or interviewing to a group that sits outside of product. And we saw about 50% of the companies sitting in this bucket. The next bucket was about 40%. This you could see, this change was being driven by the chief product officer. We actually heard a lot of stories about new chief product officer joining an organization and having to implement some of these changes. And here, what they're trying to do is, in this retain phase, is try to get the organization who hasn't traditionally done a lot of customer discovery to do it in a more systematic, structured way. And so they're introducing KPIs, leading indicators. They're trying to be predictive in terms of the customers, in terms of who they're talking to, but much of it is revenue focused. They're adding some basic governance like tracking sheets. They're sharing some learnings, and then they're starting to implement structures like customer advisory boards to try to get the product team to think a bit longer term. Sort of 18 months was the sweet spot. And then the third bucket was retain and grow. So this was an interesting one, and there was definitely a clear segment that did this, but it was quite a small percentage. And here, the discovery had one of the key things to get to this level that we saw was the discovery had very clear objectives and deliverables and ownership. And so that ownership didn't have to sit in the product organization, but they were focusing on answering some of those key questions that I referenced earlier in the presentation. So things like, what are our competitors doing? Where is our market going? Where are untapped market segments? These are the types of questions where they would create specific campaigns and give ownership to specific people in the group to ensure that they got delivered. The other interesting thing was we started to see above just the inter-team collaboration was the depth of understanding of how to do this effectively. And so the ability to spread it out across the organization really helped to share the learnings and almost became a forcing function to formalize how things were shared, how those customer themes and insights were indexed, and then clear linkage from strategy, company strategy, product strategy, down to the customer problem through to the story, some clear traceability through that route. So the next thing that sort of we want to touch on is some interesting considerations. So, in speaking to 50 plus chief product officers, we start to see, some of our own patterns as well. And so here's some 3 sort of top considerations or things to think about. So the first one was there was a real desire for teams to do more discovery, but there seems to be a lot of internal tension, and the tension is probably partly operational, where there's this full backlog of stuff that needs to be delivered, and there's a lot of people screaming to deliver it. But then there's also seems to be a bit of a change management capability challenge, where you have sort of a traditional product manager, scrum master type program manager role, who doesn't necessarily think in that creative pattern matching way. And so the difference here is, hearing a feature from a client, just going out and delivering that, or hearing a feature from a client, recognizing that that's been asked by 3 other clients and coming up with a new solution that solves a bigger problem. And so that begs the question in the change management realm is who are you actually hiring for? How are you onboarding and retaining them? How are you training them? How do you make sure you're cultivating that as part of your team? Some interesting anecdotes that came out around sort of pre-COVID, post-COVID, how remote teams has affected this type of work. And so if you are more on the creative spectrum and you're unable to collaborate with people like you did previously, and you're dependent on those sort of little interactions to fuel your creativity, you're at a real disadvantage, and you sort of have to rebuild the capability to do that. And then also the ownership from leadership and leading by example was key here, that if your senior team isn't going out and talking to customers and showing the value of that, it's going to be very hard to get everyone else to do that. The second one was this objective-based discovery. And so, like I said, there was a lot of organizations that focused on general discovery, just to get some reps and to understand the market and see those patterns. But a real progression is like, what are you actually doing, and what is the outcome? What do you want to learn, and who owns those questions? And so organizationally, you're going to have a good understanding of the questions that you need to answer, who's responsible for answering them, and holding them accountable to get that. And this type of thinking seems to set up much better collaboration between the go-to-market teams and the product teams. And then the final insight was interesting. A lot of the chief product officers that we spoke to that didn't do a lot of customer discovery today, but wanted to, were coming into organizations that were either turnarounds or not achieving the growth that they wanted to achieve. And they saw a path to growth through more learning and building sort of new and interesting products. And then there was a clear segment of company that had product market fit, in the sense that they were growing very quickly, and the percentage of time that they spent with customers was significantly higher. Now, this could be sort of causation correlation, where if you've got stronger product market fit, you're not burdened with so many feature requests, therefore you can do more customer discovery. But it was very clear that those types of organizations had a culture of sort of 50% of your time within the product group, you're talking to customers, and they'd structure things appropriately. So some interesting considerations there. And then finally, last slide before we jump to the panel, we heard some amazing things come through the calls in the form of like, oh yeah, that was amazing. I wish I did that at my previous company. And so some quick tips on how they would just do little low value things to have some pretty big wins. So we've listed them here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time because I want to go to the panel, but we'll send this out, and please do have a read through. Okay, well, so those are the sort of the setup to the panel. So I'm super excited today to introduce 3 panelists: Jordan from MemSQL, John from Grailed, and Jay, the founder of Product Council, so a 1 million+ member product management community. And so virtual panels are a little challenging. So the way I'm going to do this is sort of focus on each individually, and then open it up to the group for questions, and Jeremy will facilitate those questions. Okay, so first up is Jordan. Jordan, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. Thanks.
Yeah, Jordan, thanks for joining. So for the group, do you mind introing yourself and giving us a quick background on you and MemSQL as well?
Yeah, sure. So I've spent most of my career actually as an engineer. I was one of the people that started Google BigQuery a little bit over 10 years ago, which is a very, we had very little product management. So the engineers had to sort of be the product managers themselves, and probably from product people is that they're like, oh, whatever, there's no way you could do that. And yes, we made a lot of mistakes, but I think I learned a lot in the process. I ended up as the engineering director in charge of BigQuery. Then I switched to product, and I was the product director in charge of Google BigQuery for a couple of years. And then a few months ago, switched over to MemSQL as the chief product officer. So we're building the database of now. It's a database product And it's a very kind of technical product. And so the, engineering background helps a lot in that.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, having an engineering background for yourself because you have a very technical product. Do you hire technical product managers as a key criteria?
There's a balance. I think there's, like sometimes there's like really, really deep technical things. And you just need somebody that has, lives, eats, and drinks that, that technical problem. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
one guy we have on our team who was a former database professor. Like, he kind of
Right.
really understands what databases can do and what's possible. On the other hand, like one of the best hires that I made when I was at Google was somebody who had no database background, and and he was actually in a core area, and it was just like his thing was he would go to the engineers and say, like, how can I help you, how can I be useful? And
Mm-hmm.
he kind of built their trust by doing almost menial tasks like taking notes, scheduling meetings and stuff, but like just sort of he kind of learned through osmosis, learned their trust. And then and I was actually very, once he did that, was able to really make a really good impact on the team
Mm-hmm.
and the direction, and came up with a lot of things that somebody perhaps with a more traditional database background wouldn't have come up with, or different approaches. So sometimes having the generalist is also really useful.
How do you get so if you skew more on the technical side, both on the engineering front and the product management, how do you ensure that especially your product managers really understand the customer problem and get in front of customers and have empathy for the customer? How do you get them out of their comfort zone?
That's a great question, and it's one we always struggle with. I mean, there was an engineer on my team who, he kind of really struggled at developing the technical depth, and so it's harder to understand what's possible, like because otherwise, because I think one of the things that I would always hate was, people they talk to the customer, and the customer asks for X, and they come back and say, okay, we need to go build X.
Right.
And sometimes that's true, but I like to think there's like, if if your customer has a splinter, they might ask for an aspirin, and they might say, hey, I want something to make the pain go away. And what you really need is you need to take the splinter out of their finger, and you need to kind of be able to dig down and understand the depth of the problem. And sometimes that does take a little bit more technical background. So I
Mm-hmm.
think as long as when you think about designing a team and not just, assigning product managers to particular things, if you kind of have, if you have, good discussions within the team, and if you have a good balance of skill sets, then sometimes they can play off each other and be like, hey, well, no, actually we need to sort of push on this direction, or, hey, maybe there's a better way to do this.
Mm-hmm. When we spoke last, one of the things you mentioned is you would get every one of your product managers to do these one-on-one roadmap and vision presentations to the customer. I thought it was really interesting. Could you talk through briefly how you structured that?
Yeah, sure. So one thing is, we're a B2B company, enterprise B2B. Both BigQuery was that way, as is MemSQL, and I think that dramatically, the approach is very different from a consumer business. But for an enterprise business, the like when the customer gets to talk to the product manager or the product owner, like it's sort of it's a treat for them, because they get a view into sort of how decisions are being made, and if they kind of play their cards right, they can get their needs met. And so you want to not just sort of lay out, okay, here's the 27 features that we're going to add in this order. You want to get them excited about your vision of this is what the product is going to be, because they're not buying,
Mm-hmm.
Especially if your product isn't completely like done and nailed down yet, like you need to sell them on the vision. And the sales team, like, they're going to always discount kind of a little bit what the sales team is about the vision. But when they hear you as the product owner, they say, this is all the stuff that we can do together. This is all the stuff that it could be. So I think that's a big focus of the roadmap. And then kind of you go through the details, and the details are almost like scaffolding that says, hey, this
Mm-hmm.
is why we can build this. And so one of the things we found was that, there's a couple people who could deliver the full roadmap, and the full vision. But a lot of the team was focused on a more narrow scope, and so we were trying to figure out how to make it so that anybody can give that full pitch, even though they have more detailed knowledge about their features. One thing we did was that this year, because we didn't have a big conference to go to in person, which is really one of our best places to meet just a whole bunch of customers. We had it was 3 weeks of like Tuesday through Friday, and full days, like 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So we could get kind of the range of time zones, and every hour of those 3 weeks was a roadmap presentation, a one-on-one roadmap presentation from one of the product managers. And the way we would do it is we would pair up a primary and a secondary product manager. And so start out with like the first week I did a ton, and it was brutal. Doing the same pitch over and over again. And they should be interactive, and it should be, and they because if it's just delivering something, that's easy. But like when you get all the like, oh, can you do this? Can you do this?
Yeah.
But there'd be a secondary person, and the secondary person is really trying to learn. And then after they've seen a couple of them, then they deliver the roadmap presentation, and the senior people then are secondaries, because I think sometimes they get nervous, like, well, what happens if I get a question that I don't know the answer to, or what happens if somebody pokes on something? And so you have a senior person as backup. And then
are they creating that content themselves, or as a collaborative team, or is it sort of pushed down from more of the senior level?
We had a collaborative thing. So the way I did it was like each person had, or each one of the kind of the more senior PMs on the team had a kind of an area of focus. So rather than just components, it was sort of like, the database as real time. And so like the real time use cases, I had that product manager would focus on the content for the vision of the database is a real time engine. And so you break these different things up, and so everybody does have their area of specialty, but it is a collaborative
Right.
deck. And that's also like relieves some of the pressure on the product leader to have to curate this and keep it up to date. And every quarter I just say, hey, make sure you update your sections and curate them. And sometimes sometimes a weird slide will appear, like, I've never seen that one before, and you have to sort of talk through it on the fly. But I think it's just useful to have it be a collaborative experience.
Yeah. And just, two last questions. So when this was the first time you sort of forced the product team to go out and pitch because you didn't have that conference, have you noticed any changes within the team as a result of that?
I mean, definitely. It'd just be, because everybody would do, because like, somebody would want to talk about, BigQuery Omni, which was kind of our multi-cloud thing. And so our Omni PM would go and talk to them, but they would only they would just focus on that one area. Or our machine learning PM would talk about machine learning. And I think now everybody is more comfortable giving the whole end-to-end deck. And it's also kind of a more of a team sense, because everybody really gets how all the pieces fit together, and they understand what each other is doing better, and they can have sort of better, deeper product conversations.
And then last question. So Google's notorious for hiring great people. When you're hiring a product manager, knowing that sort of pattern matching and creativity is a key part, any like slam dunk interview tips to get those amazing candidates?
No, I think, I wish there was a way to like say, to hire good product managers, because sometimes it's just sort of, you're almost like you're rolling the dice, and you roll a 6, and you get somebody good, and everything else you don't. I mean, Google really does focus on creativity in the product interview loops, and so there's a number of questions that you're kind of design me this, or tell me how you would build this product, and you get good candidates that are like that, just they kind of they just start coming up with this, throwing ideas at you. Oh, and then you could do this, and then okay, and then this would open up this thing, and then you can start to see that. And I think also just asking, how have you like what have you built that was different than what customers asked for? Like sometimes
Oh, interesting.
um,
Yeah.
customers ask for X and you give them Y, and Y is actually better.
Right.
And because I think also, I've read, like part of being a good product manager is having the courage to, when a customer asks for something, to build something different.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and maybe because what they're asking for is not on strategy, or maybe it's because what they're asking for, you can solve that problem by going a little bit deeper, and have a real strategy around what you're building. Like there was an example we had. Uh, People would ask for backups and get back
So,
to point in time, and so if you can find things like that that can really help.
hmm Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Jordan, very much. John, are you there?
I am here.
John, welcome. Thank you for the time. Do you mind giving everyone a quick intro about yourself and your company, Rails?
Yeah, sure. So I have I have an interesting privilege of actually working as a designer, a developer, and a product manager. So I've had a pretty broad range of experience. I actually did the math right before this to make sure that I had the right. You always say like, oh, I've been doing this for like 10 years, but then you realize you've been saying that for like 15 years. So 17 years of experience kind of overall on the internet before half of these roles were really that well defined in the first place. And then last 9 in product management. Most of the time it's been a mix of B2C and B2B. Most recently, before the role I'm in now, I was spent a couple of years as a VP of product at Envision. So, straight B2B SaaS experience there. And the company I work at now is Grailed, which is a peer-to-peer marketplace. So similar like marketplace dynamics to eBay, most similar to Poshmark, which is one of the bigger competitors in the space. And we have a different niche that's specifically around menswear. So awesome little business with great numbers, and going out for our Series B right now. So really good place to be. Yeah, great team. Everyone surprisingly has been like the team's been really well formulated prior to me getting there, which has been great.
Mm-hmm. So you're relatively new there. Can you describe sort of the product team setup before you were there, and specifically what the focus was on customer discovery or research, and then some of the things that you've put in place?
Yeah, totally. So I've been there for about 5 months now. I feel like I can pretty much give a good, the honeymoon period's over, and I feel like I can give a pretty good kind of on that now. As far as the structure, so, we have PMs in squads. The squads are, pretty standard ratio. Everything seems about the same as you'd assume it would be anywhere else. Design reports into me as well. And so I have both the design department and the PMs, which is definitely helpful when it comes to customer discovery and kind of drawing those two together and creating a more kind of holistic process. Before I came in, it was very much centered around kind of quantitative work. So the work that you can do within the building, looking at the data, really interrogating a lot of our backend data to make sure that people understood kind of general behaviors. A lot of like A/B testing was already, we were probably at like a 3 out of 5 in terms of maturity there, which is pretty good when it hasn't been like a very top-down focus. As far as the kind of qualitative aspects of customer discovery, those were not really in place at all. There's definitely surveying, which you could kind of debate whether that's quantitative or qualitative, but for the most part, it was high output, high efficiency when it came to both the product that gets delivered as well as the discovery. When I came in, the first thing that I tried to do was lay out a process that I think makes sense for customer discovery. One of the things I think is the hardest is helping everyone understand how something goes from like being an idea to getting into a backlog for engineering. And there's a bunch of, there's a million different ways to do that. And so actually just visualizing that process and kind of my basic foundation for that so that we could have a point of conversation was really helpful. And then starting to shift us toward questions that really could only be answered with some more in-person conversations with customers to kind of make sure that as we did the quantitative aspects of the research, we were kind of complementing that so we understood not only just like the what's happening, but also the why it's happening, which is the side of things. And whenever
the change management piece was a big theme that came out of it. So like when you're coming in and making all these changes, like what were some of the hot button items? Like, for example, like why weren't they doing it before? Did you have to convince sort of senior leadership what the value was? Like any specific examples there?
Yeah, totally. So I think that, every head of product kind of brings their own flavor to the space.
Right.
The head of product that was there before me actually is now the COO. He, like I said, did an amazing job setting up the team and is a little bit more quantitatively focused. And so I think that was just like a factor of the things that we put in place, which is great because I didn't have to do that part. I got the discovery side of things that I had to kind of spin up.
Right.
I think one of the things that really kind of played in my favor was I kind of came in and said, hey, here is some like customer discovery things we should be doing. We should be thinking about like one-to-one interviews. We should be thinking about more user testing, like kind of the basics. And we did a pricing change not too long ago, and it really exposed that our relationship with our customers was not exactly what we thought it was. And so I think we did a really good job making sure that we did the right pricing change. But when it came to the customer reaction, I think that it felt like we had less empathy than we thought we had. And it really kind of exposed like us just not really having the relationship. And so, a lot of times some of the customers were like, you didn't deliver the features that we needed or the tooling that we needed in order to feel like you kind of warrant these pricing changes. But really, I think what it was much more of the relationship that we had not had, kind of hearing out these folks and making sure we're doing the right things for them, whether it's something on their list or not. And so going from that and kind of utilizing that crisis, I think I went from kind of pitching this to senior leadership and having them consider it to be something that might be inefficient and laborious to, really feeling like they understood that we needed to have more empathy for customers and spend more time really understanding customers. And so finding, some folks that were maybe a little bit more mid-level on the team that were looking to learn and jump into some new things and throwing them those opportunities, seeing them kind of accelerate, and then highlighting and spotlighting that. So a lot of that has been us creating like videos that we can drop into Slack. That's not just the clips of customers saying things, but also here's what we were going to build. Here's what we learned. Here's
cool.
how we did something like half the amount of time. And here's how it's going to be better for our sellers or for our buyers in the marketplace. So that's made
when we were chatting last, you made a super interesting point that product teams in particular can create very strong logical arguments as to why something should be done that don't actually line up to what customers want at all. And so you can get into these situations where everything makes sense logically and is defensible, but like to your point, doesn't really matter until you talk to a customer. And so it's a really, really tricky balance. You mentioned that you rolled out a customer advisory board. What were some of the specific things that you did there?
Yeah, totally. So when I was at Envision, we rolled one out that was very much kind of, I think, as you and I talked about, pretty classically oriented around annual recurring revenue and going to the biggest customers that we had. And it was very much like a sales, product marketing, and product management kind of oriented customer advisory board, which was still extremely valuable, especially in the design space where design leaders are not that much further in their career than some of the mid-levels or senior folks there. For us on this side, I thought it was really important for us to make sure that we had kind of a broader segmentation. We have like power sellers for sure, and we have casual sellers, and we have buyers. And so one of the things I want to do is kind of bring all of those folks together, and then also seed conversation amongst them, because a lot of the folks that we pulled in are also the ones that are the most vocal in our community. And so now instead of them kind of taking shots at us whenever we've screwed up, it's really them kind of being involved in co-development with us, such that they can kind of better explain to the community on our behalf why we've made certain choices or why trade-offs were necessary to make the best experience in the market occur.
Yeah, it's interesting. Are you able to quantify or articulate the difference between those segments in terms of need through that CAB exercise? This segment is like inherently different than that previous segment.
Totally. And so I think that's where it's really important when you think about that type of segmentation to understand your business. At Envision, you could go to Google and you could go to the smallest company, that has a design team, and their needs are actually quite similar because those teams scale horizontally instead of vertically. For us, it's very different when it comes to, power sellers versus casual sellers. And so, we have some very specific understandings around like where those challenges are and where people are kind of in that maturity curve, who wants to become the kind of power seller and who's just really happy being a casual seller. Same thing with buyers. We have people that are on the platform all the time buying like crazy, and then folks that are kind of just dipping in and out. And so having that segmentation is really helpful, especially whenever it comes to our general research. But when it comes to the customer advisory board, it's like, as I said, like super important for us because we need to have that broader perspective, or else we're building for a very narrow part of the market.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll move on to Jay now. Jay, you there?
G'day, Grant. Great to be here. Pleasure to be alongside yourself, John.
Jay, thank you so much for joining. I'm super excited to have you on. You're kind of adding a different perspective. So when I interviewed Jay, he had like 3 full-time jobs, so he's got so much on the go. But the thing that I found most interesting was some of his insights onto some of the emerging trends based on his work with Product Coalition. But anyway, Jay, if you could give first tell us where in the world you are, but then give us an overview of all the things you're doing, and then if we could dig into some of those trends with the remaining time, it'd be amazing.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm joining you from down in the Algarve in Portugal. That's my hideout during this global pandemic. So it's a pleasure to be on the call with. We've got 66 people here, which is fantastic. So thanks for listening in. For me right now, I'm spread across many things. I'm over at findyourbgrind.com, which is an edtech startup business on the west coast of the USA. There, where I'm VP of product, and we're very much in the scrappy startup mode for both B2C and B2B plays there. I'm also involved with a coffee business called proudmary.com, which is based up in Seattle as well. Up in Portland as well as in Melbourne, Australia. And that gives me a whole different view on product management, because I get to see product management through the eyes of tangible products and things like logistics and crop management and farms, which is a whole different game, which I really enjoy. And as you mentioned, I've got Product Coalition, which is really, it's my hobby. It's how I give back to the community, and it's a community I started back in 2014 that's now gone from a Medium publication into a Slack channel and beyond. So it's really great to be leading that community globally.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm assuming through that community, you're seeing lots of different things from lots of different types of product people. Can you talk through some of the sort of 2 or 3 interesting trends that you're seeing as of late in product management?
Yeah, so particularly this year, there's obviously an incredible amount of change. Patterns are changing very fast. I'd say coming into this year, what I'm able to see is the data that drives traffic to Product Coalition and the conversations in the Slack channel. And so for me, countries like India, for instance, the conversation 12 months ago was heavily focused on getting into product management and what I call sort of the basics of coming in to product management and hitting that medium. Where that is now is simply maturing. But what I'm also seeing is conversations that used to happen in the Indian Slack channels, for instance, all around remote product management, are now happening in the American and European Slack channels. And so I'm seeing sort of almost a reverse of skills being traded from India, which has done awesome jobs at management over the States and Europe, and now teaching and leading the way on remote product management for the European and American markets.
Yeah, there's a lot of organizations that are now remote for the first time, and there's a lot of organizations that have been remote for quite a while. Like, are you seeing a huge advantage to those remote companies just knowing how to work in that environment? And is there anything in particular that they do really well that the other groups don't do quite well yet?
I wouldn't say I'd see that. I think what I definitely see though is hiring for remote product teams is changing.
Yeah.
There's been some lessons learned this year by product managers who have identified the opportunity to hire remotely in different time zones and countries, but have sometimes stretched that time zone bracket too far.
Interesting.
So sometimes you're thinking, 4-hour overlap's great, and then it turns out actually, you know what, you're going to need a 6 to 8 hour overlap from time zone. There's certainly some learnings product teams are going through as they learn to work remotely, but also on the tooling side, as we've on what you presented there, but also just generally in the market, tool growth has been huge this year.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, I thought it was really interesting that I felt acutely in my company was product managers moving too quickly up the organization without developing some of their core skill sets. Could you maybe touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so when we think about a board level and an executive level, the requirements to be there historically, let's go back 10 years. We're pretty significant. There was, I'm not one for MBAs, but there's a lot of weight on MBAs, particularly if you're a serious business, cleared that Series A, Series B, etc. And so what we've seen, I find in the last 10 years, is great product managers stepping in to become great product leaders, and then stepping very rapidly to become product executives, and sometimes too fast. So they're very great at product, but like any executive, you really need to know the full systems understanding. How does this company run for you to add value at the boardroom level? And there's quite a few product managers I've seen step up into that role who really weren't prepared for it. And the boards are hiring for those roles, obviously very rapidly. Product has never been a sexier term than it's been in the last 5 years. And so for me, it's all about those people going into those roles. Be aware of what you're going into. My worry for the industry is product managers moving up too fast, damage to the term of product management and what it means for value creation at a board level. And I think it's on all of us to really look after the craft of product management at that highest level.
Yeah, and then just on that topic, any advice for a head of product that has a rising star in their team that is tempted to jump for a title that may not have the skill set to be really successful at that level? Any advice to help sort of coach them through?
It's a great question. Advice, I think, is a bit like discovery. Why are you interested in that role? Let's go down the 5 whys path. 5 whys, here we go. Why that? Why this? Why that? And identify whether it's all adding up. Whether where can you help them? Where is the riskiest assumption in this career move that could cause you to fall down at a later point? So it's much like some of the questions and considerations that we talk about in customer discovery. I think you could apply that to leadership and career discovery for your team members.
Yeah, actually, one thing that came out in the last research just on that topic was like a chief product officer at a larger company has responsibilities just outside delivering product. They're looking at M&A, they're looking at finance, and so along the discovery vein, pushing that rising product manager to actually go out and talk to real veteran chief product officers and actually hear specifically what they do every day and contrast that with your smaller job at, say, a startup, and make sure that you've got a clear path to get there. It could be really interesting. Awesome. I want to leave some time for some questions. We've got a bunch of them queued up. But before I do that, please, huge thank you to Jordan, John, and Jay for carving out time to do this. They had no reason to do it, so really, really appreciate your time, and thank you for all your insights. And so I'll pass it to Jeremy to finish off with some questions.
Yeah, we've got a ton of good questions that have come through the chat, both privately and publicly. I'll just kind of rapid fire, and if anybody wants to take the floor and quickly answer it, feel free to. First question, how do you prioritize the findings from customer discovery? I think this one relates to how do you share what you find?
Yeah, anyone on the panel want to jump in on that one?
I can jump in. So a few things that I think John was talking about earlier, and Grant, you related to it. But with these findings, there's something around in the research around asking leading questions. And I think the connection or correlation between those leading questions and false positives is highly likely to be significant. And so I think when it comes to the findings, don't just take them as what they are. Identify what are some of the false positives or false negatives before you look to filter them down into true insights that you can leverage. But I might hand over maybe to John to carry on the conversation.
Yeah, so I think in general, prioritization is an interesting one, especially I think whenever you work in a B2B company, the sales team is always asking, like, how is it that you prioritize? Which is really them saying, I have customers that are asking for something and I'm not seeing it get done. So why aren't you doing it? So I think that speaking overall to like the broader way that we prioritize and getting everybody involved in understanding how that works is, first of all, a huge pain in the ass, but extremely critical whenever it comes to doing product management properly and getting the buy-in from the organization. As a part of that, I think it's talking about all the different data that we receive in order to drive general prioritization and to take different aspects of customer discovery and infuse that into the rest of that data, right? Like that's where you're getting, when we talk about like user science or whatever, or customer discovery, what we're talking about is like 10 different tools to receive data that we can utilize to ensure that it makes sense with our vision and strategy to just generally prioritize. And so I think really articulating and showing your work when it comes to how you delivered a decision can be really helpful in generally kind of speaking to that. As far as like whenever you have two competing opportunities that are specifically around some piece of customer discovery, I think it really comes down to all those aspects that are internal to the business to help you decide, what makes the most sense. You have probably a million internal competing factors that can help to kind of figure out exactly what it is that needs to be done next.
If I could add just really briefly, I think, I'm not the person that came up with these, but I think that, ranking on the, pain, how painful is it? How frequent is it? How often people see it? And then how much are people going to be willing to pay if you solve the problem? That can really help, inform prioritization.
Awesome. I think we only have time for one more question, so I'll queue this one up. But just before we do that, I sent a link in the chat for anybody that wants to leave feedback on our session today. So last question, how do you suggest an approach to customer discovery on more of a larger set of customers or a broader perspective rather than maybe just your one or two major clients? This seems like a question more in B2B.
I'll just jump in really quickly. I think one is just you want to not just be locked into anecdotes, and so you kind of need to you want to turn anecdotes into data. And if you have 100,000 users, then really you should be like completely data driven. If you have 10 users, then you're going to be more anecdote driven. So I think just trying to get enough interviews and enough non-leading questions to be able to see a little bit of the broader background rather than just the this one customer has this weird thing and you probably don't want to just focus on that.
Awesome. Well, we are officially out of time. Again, huge thank you to the panelists. Huge thank you for the attendees. Feedback on this would be fantastic. Again, this is Jeremy and I on passion project. So if you want to see more of it, let us know the topics and if you're interested in this stuff. And have a great rest of week and stay safe and healthy. And hopefully we can all reconnect very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks all. Bye.